Our senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell joins us now. Kelly, talk to me about reaction from the Biden administration, obviously watching this with great concern tonight.
Well, Lester, there are important steps that the administration takes at this point. The current president has been briefed by the director of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheadle, and of course, her agents were with former President Trump, are getting direct information from the scene to the president. In addition, the president has been talking with his Secretary of Homeland Security and his Homeland Security advisor inside the White House. That, of course, is Alejandro Mayorkas, the secretary at the cabinet level, and Liz Sherwood Randall, who advises the president on potential homeland threats inside the United States. In this moment, it is not candidate and candidate. This is the sitting president having to deal with the law enforcement piece, the national security implications, and sort of the mindset of the nation when an event like this happens. So the president is getting those threads of information coming into him. He is in Delaware right now. The vice president has also received an initial briefing. And certainly we are also hearing from others who have had their own experience and still do with the Secret Service. Former President George W. Bush putting out a statement saying that he and Laura Bush are grateful to the Secret Service that they were able to get former President Trump to safety, and they're concerned, of course, about what this incident was about, and they thank first responders for their swift action. So all the apparatus of the federal government shifts to deal with something like this. The Secret Service is involved in the investigation. They are also, of course, involved in the day-to-day protection of the former president. I have been told, based on my reporting, that the level of protection that he would receive as a former president, which has been his existence these last 3.5 years, heading into the convention in Milwaukee, he would be getting a larger detail as the presumptive candidate going forward. So expecting already plans in the works for him to have a more robust set of agents and procedures around him. They're also, of course, waiting to envelop the new running mate to be named at some point, and that person would also have Secret Service protection when former President Trump announces his pick. What happened today rattles the very core of the Secret Service. They do train for this. They are dealing with this potential threat at every event all the time. Here at the White House, where I am right now, no visible sign of any enhanced security. They are focused on certainly the events surrounding the former president at that location. It would also include state and local authorities who would be on the ground participating in the investigation, which would typically be led by the FBI. So as far as any contact from the president, he's got a team of senior advisors around him who are able to give him direct information from the Secret Service as well as the Department of Justice, law enforcement, and importantly, those Homeland Security advisors, both at the cabinet level and inside the White House, who may have more of a picture about potential threats or concerns that our colleague Tom Winter was talking about. That's where we are at this point from the White House, Lester.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.